You can leave anytime, the cowboy said. What the mail-order bride did shocked the whole town. The rope burned through Eliza Merrick's gloves as she hauled the water bucket up from the well, her arms screaming in protest. She'd been at Garrett Wade's ranch for 3 weeks, and already her hands looked like they belonged to someone else, cracked, calloused, bleeding at the knuckles. When the bucket finally cleared the stone rim, she set it down too hard, sloshing half the water onto her boots. "Easy," Garrett's voice came from somewhere behind the barn. "Water's scarce this time of year." Eliza didn't turn around. She'd learned that much about him already. He wasn't cruel, just blunt. Every word he spoke came out like he'd rationed it from a limited supply. She lifted the bucket again, steadier this time, and started toward the house. The Wyoming sun beat down on her neck, and dust devils spun across the dry earth between the barn and the porch. Everything here was brown or gray or faded to nothing. Even the sky looked wrung out. She'd come from Philadelphia with a trunk full of dresses she'd never wear again and a letter that promised a partnership, not a prison. Garrett Wade, rancher, 34, seeking a woman of practical nature for marriage and shared work, must be willing to adapt to frontier life. Transportation provided. Eliza had read it 20 times before answering, imagining a man who wanted conversation over supper, someone to share the burden of isolation. What she'd found instead was a weathered stranger who spoke maybe 10 sentences a day and expected her to know how to do everything from milking cows to mending fences. She set the bucket on the porch and flexed her aching fingers. Through the window, she could see Garrett moving around the barn, his hat pulled low, shoulders tight with whatever thoughts he never shared. They'd been married by the circuit judge the day she arrived, a ceremony that lasted 4 minutes in the parlor of the only boarding house in Salvation Creek, a town so small it barely deserved the name. Garrett had shaken her hand afterward like they'd just concluded a business transaction. "You can leave anytime," he'd said that night, standing in the doorway of the room he'd given her, his own room, she'd later realized. He'd moved his things to a cot in the barn. "I won't stop you, won't even blame you." She should have taken him up on it right then, should have climbed back on that wagon and headed east before the dust of Salvation Creek even settled. But something in his voice had caught her, not quite loneliness, but something close to it. And she'd spent enough years in Philadelphia watching her father drink himself to death, while her mother pretended everything was fine, to recognize the particular shade of resignation in Garrett's eyes. So she'd stayed. The days blurred together in a haze of heat and exhaustion. She learned to start the wood stove without burning herself, to churn butter until her arms went numb, to tell the difference between a cow in distress and one just complaining. Garrett taught her nothing directly. He'd just do a task near her, and she'd watch, and eventually she'd try it herself while he worked on something else nearby, close enough to help if she needed it, but far enough away to let her figure things out. The town wasn't much friendlier. Salvation Creek consisted of a general store, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a saloon Eliza had never entered, and maybe 30 families scattered across the surrounding ranches. The women at church looked at her like they were waiting for something, for her to fail, maybe, or leave, or prove she was exactly the kind of desperate city woman they'd expected. "She won't last," Eliza had overheard Clara Brennan tell someone after service. "Too soft, you can see it in her hands." That was 2 weeks ago. Now Eliza's hands were anything but soft, and she was still here. She carried the water inside and started washing the breakfast dishes, tin plates crusted with egg and bacon grease. The house was small but solidly built, one main room with a kitchen area, a bedroom she used alone, and Garrett's cot out in the barn where he slept regardless of weather. He'd built the place himself. She'd learned from Martha Hayes, who ran the general store. Built it for a woman who'd promised to come west with him, then changed her mind at the last minute. That was 6 years ago. Eliza dried the plates and stacked them on the shelf, then stood at the window watching Garrett work. He moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done everything 1,000 times, never wasting a motion. His horse, a gray gelding named Smoke, stood tied to the fence post, ears flicking at flies. The whole scene looked like something from a painting, man and animal against endless brown emptiness. She didn't hear him come in until he spoke. "Need to ride into town for supplies," Garrett said from the doorway. "You coming or staying?" Eliza turned. He stood with his hat in his hands, fingers working the brim the way he always did when he was uncomfortable. It was the longest he'd ever looked directly at her. "I'll come," she said. Something shifted in his face, not quite relief, but close. He nodded once and headed back outside. The ride to Salvation Creek took an hour, and they spent most of it in silence. The wagon creaked and bounced over the rutted road, and Eliza gripped the seat to keep from sliding around. Garrett held the reins loose and easy, his eyes on the horizon. Twice she thought about saying something, commenting on the weather, asking about the ranch, anything to break the quiet, but each time the words died in her throat. "Ranch is struggling," Garrett said suddenly, startling her. He didn't look over. "Drought's been hard. Lost 6 head this month already. Bank's getting impatient." Eliza waited, but he didn't elaborate. She'd learned that about him too. He'd offer a piece of information and then leave it there, like he was testing to see if you'd run with it or ignore it. "What happens if the rain doesn't come?" she asked finally. "Sell off more cattle, take a loan I can't afford, maybe lose the whole thing." His jaw tightened. "That's why I wrote that letter. Needed help, couldn't afford to hire hands and wasn't about to." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Wasn't about to what?" "Wasn't about to trick someone into thinking this was something it's not." He glanced at her then, quick and guarded. "You came out here for a partnership. That's what I offered. But I know it's not what you're getting. I know I'm not." He stopped himself again, throat working. Eliza felt something twist in her chest. "You think I expected some romantic fantasy? I'm not a child, Garrett. I knew what frontier life meant." "Did you?" His voice came out sharper than she'd ever heard it. "Because every day I watch you struggle with things you've never done before. And I think about how I pulled you away from everything you knew for this. For," he gestured at the empty land stretching away in all directions, "for nothing." "It's not nothing. It's close enough." The town appeared ahead, wavering in the heat like a mirage. Garrett drove the wagon straight to the general store and climbed down without another word. Eliza sat for a moment, watching him tie off the horses, his movements stiff with something she couldn't quite name. Anger, maybe, or shame. Inside the store, Martha Hayes greeted them with her usual tight smile. "Eliza, Garrett, what can I help you with today?" Garrett handed over a list, and Martha started gathering items: flour, salt, coffee, a few other essentials. Eliza wandered toward the bolts of fabric near the back, running her fingers over calico prints she'd once have scorned. Now they looked almost beautiful. "Heard your well's running dry," a man's voice said behind her. Eliza turned to find Samuel Pierce, owner of the largest ranch in the area, standing with his thumbs hooked in his belt. He was maybe 50, with silver hair and the kind of confidence that came from never having to prove anything. "We are managing," Eliza said carefully. "Are you?" Pierce smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Because I've made Garrett a fair offer twice now, good money for that land. He keeps refusing, but," he looked her up and down, "maybe you could talk some sense into him. Woman like you probably isn't used to living so rough." "I'm fine." "For now." Pierce leaned closer, and Eliza caught the smell of tobacco and whiskey. "But when things get really bad, and they will, you'll wish he'd listened. No shame in admitting this life isn't for everyone." "The lady said she's fine." Garrett's voice cut across the store like a whip crack. He stood near the counter, supplies bundled in his arms, eyes fixed on Pierce with an intensity that made the older man step back. "Just being neighborly, Wade." "Sure you are." Garrett moved to Eliza's side, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. "We are done here." They loaded the wagon in silence, and Eliza could feel the eyes of half the town on them. Clara Brennan stood on the church steps with 2 other women, whispering behind their hands. A group of men outside the saloon watched with idle interest. Eliza climbed onto the wagon seat and waited while Garrett settled the supplies in back. "What did Pierce say to you?" he asked once they were moving. "Just trying to convince me you should sell." Garrett's hands tightened on the reins. "Man's been after my land since I bought it, claims he needs the water rights, but really, he just wants to own everything from here to the mountains." He shook his head. "I won't give him the satisfaction." even if it means losing everything. Even then. They rode in silence for a while, the sun sinking toward the horizon and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Eliza watched Garrett from the corner of her eye, studying the hard line of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. He'd been carrying this alone for so long, the drought, the debt, the slow collapse of everything he'd built. No wonder he barely spoke. What was there to say? "I'm not leaving," she said quietly. Garrett looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd arrived. "Why?" "Because you need help, because I said I would, because—" She hesitated, then pushed forward. "Because running back to Philadelphia won't make anything better. At least here I'm useful." "Useful," he repeated the word like it tasted strange. "That what you want to be?" "It's more than I was before." Something in his expression cracked open, just for a second, and Eliza saw past the walls he'd built to the exhausted, desperate man underneath. Then he looked away, and the moment passed. The rain came 3 days later. Eliza woke to the sound of water drumming on the roof, and for a confused moment she thought she was back in Philadelphia, in her narrow room above her father's shop. Then she remembered the ranch, the dust, Garrett sleeping out in the barn, no matter how many times she'd told him to take his own bed back. She dressed quickly and hurried outside. The rain fell in sheets, turning the dry earth to mud, filling the water troughs and barrels faster than she'd thought possible. Garrett stood in the middle of it all, face turned up to the sky, arms spread wide. He was laughing. Eliza had never heard him laugh before. The sound was rusty, unpracticed, but genuine. She stepped off the porch into the downpour, rain soaking through her dress in seconds, and Garrett turned to her with something like joy in his eyes. "It's raining," he said, like she might not have noticed. "I see that. Been waiting 8 months for this." He grabbed her hands, his grip strong and sure. 8 months. They stood there together, rain pouring down, until Eliza started laughing too, at the absurdity of it, at the relief in Garrett's face, at the sheer improbability of finding herself here, in Wyoming, holding hands with a near stranger in the middle of a miracle. When the rain finally stopped, they worked together to check the animals and secure anything that had blown loose. Garrett moved differently now, lighter somehow, like the rain had washed away some of the weight he'd been carrying. He even smiled at her once, quick and uncertain, when they nearly collided coming around opposite sides of the barn. That night, he knocked on her door after supper. "Come in," Eliza called, setting down her sewing. Garrett stood in the doorway, hat in hand again, but this time he stepped inside instead of hovering at the threshold. "Wanted to say thank you." "For what?" "For staying, for not," he gestured vaguely, "for not giving up when things got hard. I know it hasn't been what you expected." Eliza set the sewing aside and stood. They were only a few feet apart now, close enough to see the silver threaded through his dark hair, the scar above his left eyebrow, the way his eyes weren't quite brown or hazel, but somewhere in between. "Nothing's ever what we expect," she said. "Doesn't mean it's wrong." Garrett studied her face like he was seeing her for the first time. "You're stronger than you look." "So are you." He laughed again, softer this time. "I don't feel strong, feel like I'm barely holding on most days." "That's what strength is," Eliza said, "holding on when everything tells you to let go." Something shifted between them then, a recognition, maybe, or an understanding that went deeper than words. Garrett reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "Haven't had anyone close to me in a long time. Don't know how to talk to you, how to—" He broke off, frustrated. "How to be a husband instead of just a rancher who happens to be married." "You could start by moving back into the house," Eliza said. "It's your room, Garrett. I shouldn't have taken it. I wanted you to have it. And I want you to stop sleeping in the barn like you're some kind of hired hand." She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "We're supposed to be partners, remember? Partners don't make each other sleep outside." Garrett's breath caught, and for a long moment he just stood there, looking at her like, She was something precious and fragile that he was afraid to touch. Then, very carefully, he cupped her face in both hands and kissed her. It was chaste and brief, barely more than a brush of lips, but Eliza felt it all the way to her bones. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright. "I'll move my things in tomorrow," he said hoarsely. The weeks that followed brought more rain, and with it new growth. The grass came back green and thick, and the cattle fattened. Garrett hired 2 ranch hands with money they suddenly had, and the work became manageable instead of crushing. He started talking more, not eloquent speeches, but real conversation. He told her about learning ranching from his father, about the woman who'd promised to come west and then abandoned him, about the loneliness that had made him write that letter in the first place. Eliza told him about Philadelphia, about her father's slow decline, about feeling invisible in a city full of people, about answering his letter because she'd wanted to matter to someone, to be more than just another face in the crowd. They shared the bedroom now, though Garrett still gave her space, still moved like he was afraid of crowding her. But gradually, tentatively, they found their rhythm. She'd wake to find his arm draped across her waist. He'd come in from working to find supper waiting and her smile welcoming him home. They learned each other in increments, how she took her coffee, how he liked his eggs, the small gestures that meant "I see you, I'm glad you're here." The town noticed. Clara Brennan stopped whispering when Eliza walked past. Martha Hayes started saving the best cuts of fabric for her. Samuel Pierce tipped his hat once and kept walking, his offer to buy Garrett's land apparently forgotten. "They're impressed," Garrett said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Thought you'd run for sure." "They underestimated me." "I did too." He pulled her closer, his arms solid around her shoulders. "Won't make that mistake again." Eliza leaned into him, breathing in the smell of leather and hay and rain-washed earth. "I love you," she said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. Garrett went very still, then he turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Say it again." "I love you." His kiss was fiercer this time, full of all the words he still didn't know how to say. When he pulled back, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "Didn't think I'd ever hear that. Didn't think I deserved to." "You do," Eliza said firmly. "You're a good man, Garrett Wade. Stubborn as hell, terrible at conversation, but good." He laughed and pulled her close again, burying his face in her hair. "Love you too," he murmured against her temple. "Should have said it before, should have." "You're saying it now, that's what matters." They sat together as the sky deepened from orange to purple to star-speckled black, and Eliza thought about the letter that had brought her here, the promise of partnership that had seemed like such a gamble. She'd come to Wyoming expecting nothing and found everything: purpose, belonging, love. "You know what I realized," Garrett said after a long silence. "What?" "You never did leave." He smiled, slow and genuine. "I told you that first night you could go anytime, that I wouldn't stop you, but you stayed." "Of course I stayed." "Why of course? You had every reason to go." Eliza considered the question, watching the stars emerge one by one. "Because leaving would have been easy," she said finally, "and I was tired of taking the easy way, tired of being the woman everyone expected me to be, quiet, obedient, forgettable." She met his eyes. "Here I can be something different, someone strong." Garrett traced her cheek with one calloused thumb. "You were always strong, just took the right place for you to see it." Maybe he was right. Maybe she'd carried this strength all along, buried under years of being told she wasn't enough, wasn't capable, wasn't worth the trouble. Coming to Wyoming hadn't created something new. It had just stripped away everything that was hiding what was already there. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For writing that letter, for being honest about what you needed, for letting me be useful." "You're more than useful, Eliza. He struggled for words, then gave up and kissed her again instead. Later, as they lay in bed listening to the wind whisper across the prairie, Garrett's hand found hers in the darkness. "Stay," he said, "not a question this time, a request." Eliza laced her fingers through his and held on tight. "I'm not going anywhere." And she meant it. Philadelphia was another lifetime ago, another person entirely. This was home now, this ranch, this man, this hard, beautiful country that demanded everything and gave back just enough to make you want to keep trying. She'd come west as a mail-order bride, a transaction, a solution to someone else's problem. But she'd become something more, a partner, a rancher, a woman who could haul water and mend fences and face down men like Samuel Pierce without flinching. She'd become herself. Outside, the rain started again, gentle this time, a whisper against the windows. Garrett's breathing evened out beside her, and Eliza closed her eyes, imagining tomorrow, more work, more challenges, more moments of unexpected joy. It wouldn't be easy. This life never was. But it would be hers, built with her own hands alongside someone who saw her strength and cherished it. The woman who'd stepped off that wagon 3 months ago wouldn't have believed it. But that woman was gone now, replaced by someone harder, braver, more certain of her own worth. Someone who'd looked at the vast emptiness of Wyoming and decided it was exactly where she belonged. Eliza smiled in the darkness and held Garrett's hand a little tighter. Let Clara Brennan whisper, let Samuel Pierce scheme, let the whole town watch and wonder. She wasn't going anywhere. She was finally, truly home.